So I recognize Dr. Tomberlin for his presentation on the history of student surveys in North Carolina. Dr. Tomberlin.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Kobe. Good morning, members of the board. So I've been asked by the board to present a brief history of student surveys in North Carolina, how they began, how we conducted surveys in the past, and how that's led to the current incarnation of the student surveys that we've discussed last month at the board meeting. So to start it off, I'll begin with the 2011-12 school year when we used the tripod survey, which was developed by Dr. Ron Ferguson from Harvard University. In that particular pilot, DPI sampled schools across the state for inclusion in the pilot. We had more than 125,000 students from about 41 LEAs. That particular administration was both online and paper, and it did actually survey kindergarten through second grade students as well as 3 through 12 students. Those were all on paper and had a different response scale. I think smiley, what we would call emojis, is that the little emoticons, the faces. So we were a little ahead of our time then. The survey length was about 120 questions. We piloted two versions, a long version and a short version. The long version was 120 questions and the short version was 60. As you can imagine, we received lots of feedback from schools that the 120 question survey was a little onerous. We did this at the end of April to the end of May, which of course in retrospect was not a good window. We've learned from this since a lot of districts at that time were testing EOCs, EOGs and preparing for those. And the feedback from the districts was, please avoid this window in the future. And we released those data back to the districts in September of 2012. One of the issues that surrounded this particular administration was the way that the data were analyzed determined whether there was a relationship between student surveys and student outcomes. I was actually working for one of the districts at the time that the report was issued to the State Board of Education, and I think there was some problems in the analysis, the methodology of the analysis. That report concluded that there was no relationship between student surveys and student outcomes, which was troubling to many of us in the field because we knew the national research suggested there was a very strong relationship between the two. Subsequently, after I came to DPI, one of the first things I did was re-examine that relationship and submitted a report to DPI that showed that there was in fact a strong connection between those student survey results and student outcomes. As part of this, this is very difficult to see, so I hope you can see it on your displays. As part of the process of talking about the tripod survey and using student perception surveys in general, we talked with teacher groups across the state in our Race to the Top regional meetings, and in those cases we asked the teachers how they felt about student surveys and what the utility of these surveys. And as you can see from these diagrams, this was taken from one this is a dot exercise where teachers place their reaction to a certain question on a continuum, and most of these questions related to the use of student surveys in informing their practice. And in this particular case, most of the teachers indicated very strongly that they felt that student surveys had a place in helping them understand their effectiveness and how they could be more effective, and felt like they could get behind student surveys and get their district to get behind student surveys. In 2013-14, we were approached by the Panorama student survey Panorama is a company that was piloting a student survey, asking us if we'd help with the pilot to validate a new instrument they had developed. This was particularly appealing to us because this instrument, unlike the tripod survey, was open source. So we would be able to use the instrument however we wanted. We could make changes to the instrument if we felt like it was necessary, and we were not bound to a particular vendor for the administration of the survey. So we assisted with this. This was funded through a grant that Panorama had gotten, so it was at no cost to the state. And in this survey, everything was done online. You can see the small sample size. We only had 10 volunteer LEAs, and there was not full participation within the LEAs. The survey was still approximately 70 questions, and we found that that there was a positive response to the survey in general. Still, the feedback was this is too long, it takes too much time, but the teachers were pleased with the results they got back, the way that the results were communicated back to them, and generally it was pretty good, but too small to make any real generalizations about effectiveness between the student surveys and student outcomes for those teachers. We went back to Panorama and communicated the feedback we received from the state, letting them know that while there was positive views towards the survey itself, the length of the survey was really a huge issue for teachers and students. And so in 14-15, we piloted smaller versions of the survey, shorter versions of the survey, with about 24,000 students across the state, but this time in only 6 LEAs. So you can see that while the pool of participating LEAs was smaller, the participation within the LEAs was much greater than what we had seen before. Again, these were only online. The data came back to these teachers in August of 2015. We did find that the questions in these shorter versions were the culling of the survey did not result in any less strong association with student outcomes that we observed for the sample. Again, we don't have enough to make generalizations statewide about whether these student surveys are strongly associated with student outcomes. But what we saw within those that were sampled was that there was a relationship, and that relationship was not diminished by the smaller, with a shorter assessment version. In 2015-16, we continued the piloting, and this is just data from the January administration. We've had 11,000 students take the student survey in January from 5 LEAs. The administration is online only. We don't have a paper version of this. And you can see the survey length remains consistent, about 29 questions to 34 questions. The biggest thing that we're finding from this survey that's I think is really important is the average time for a student to take a survey in grades 3 through 5 is 5 minutes and 16 seconds. The average time for a high school student is 4.94 minutes. And so what we've really tried to do with these surveys is listen to the feedback from the field and develop a system that gets good information into the hands of teachers, but is not burdensome, doesn't require days of administration. Students can take these surveys on just about any smart device that they might have. And or the district can use computer labs to administer the surveys. But we feel like the time that is required to administer these is very small in relation to the information that the teacher would potentially receive from them. And then the final slide I have is just information that's been presented to the State Board of Education regarding student surveys over the last few years. And of course, this starts with Dr. Ron Ferguson from Harvard. That presentation was actually done by DPI staff, but used the presentation he had delivered in North Carolina to a variety of groups regarding the use of student surveys in teacher improvement efforts. And then 3 different presentations by Dr. Gary Henry, whose last one was in September of this past year, about the value of using student surveys in a teacher evaluation system. So I feel confident that there were probably some questions that board members would like to ask. So that's a brief
Questions and
overview.
Comments? Yes,
How
Mr.
does
Alcorn.
the student survey outcomes, how do they compare to what the principal would view as far as the teacher, as far as the answers to the questions? Are there any aha moments in it? Is it consistent with what the principal would say about what the students are thinking?
One of the things we know about the principal evaluation instrument is that the inflation of ratings in the principal observation system makes it very difficult to correlate to any student outcomes. When everybody's up here, there's no correlation with a distribution of performance along things like student growth. And so that's one of the issues. It's very hard to say that the evaluations are predictive of more or less effective teaching. Student surveys, at least from the tripod information we have, which is about 4 years old now, but the tripod information did show a very strong correlation between students' perceptions of the teacher's instructional practice and better outcomes in terms of growth.
Okay, Mr. Collins?
First of all, I just want to say that I'm very much surprised at some of this information. I think that the department has been going on for quite a long time working on student surveys, and I think we've just now found out about it. I think that my question is, what are you trying to accomplish?
So with everything we do with teacher...
What's your end in mind is what I'm getting at. Where are you going to go with student surveys? What are you trying to do? What's
So in all we do in the educator effectiveness division is to help teachers, to give teachers information that will help them grow and improve their practice. So the end is, if we can get information to teachers about their practice from the student's perspective, from the principal's perspective, and from student assessments that can help them improve, that's the end.
Is this part of an evaluation instrument?
We've never done anything to move student surveys into a formal measure of the evaluation process, no. We see it as information for the teacher to help them improve their practice.
Well, I think the times when Dr. Henry was talking about, it was talked about in the connection of using it for some sort of evaluation, and that's what I don't understand. I think student surveys have been done I know in my district for a long time, for many different purposes and different things, and I'm just wondering what's the standardization behind it? What are we trying to accomplish?
Well, I think it's true that a lot of districts do student surveys. I don't know if they do student surveys related to teachers' instructional practice. There's a lot of safety surveys. There's a lot of student hope surveys. A lot of surveys about the students' kind of emotional state. This particular survey is directed specifically towards the student's perception of the instruction they're receiving and how it resonates with them. And I don't think that is as common across the state as this general notion of surveying students.
Well, last meeting, Dr. Shotwell certainly indicated that he felt like that this board was moving forward to require this to be mandated. And that was certainly the feedback that I was getting from superintendents. And my response essentially was, no, we haven't even talked about it. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, how did we get to a position in which our superintendents believe that we were getting ready to mandate something when it doesn't appear the department really has any idea of what it's trying to accomplish?
May I respond?
Dr. Atkinson?
First of all, I have sent to our superintendents on at least 2 occasions emails and notices saying that that we want this to be voluntary. We know that school districts are at different places when it comes to student surveys. For example, we know that some of our school districts are doing advanced ed, not licensure, but accreditation. We know that there are some schools, such as Charlotte Mecklenburg, I believe, who has had a student survey. But initially, we have to go back in history as to why we got to this place. Before, and I cannot remember the exact year, but it was in the 2009, 2010, 2011 era when we had a meeting with superintendents across the state, and the superintendents heard the presentation from Dr. Ron Ferguson indicating the potential power of helping improve instruction through administering a student survey. So it was that time that some of the superintendents, and now some of them have retired, said, could you help us as a Department of Public Instruction to do some research to find a way where we could have student surveys that would help us improve the instructional process. So we've been on that journey. The end goal is if school districts want to have a survey to administer that they believe and that research shows will help improve student achievement across the state, then it has been our work to get to that part. And during the time of Race to the Top, we have had Dr. Gary Henry here on numerous occasions talking with us about the impact of student survey and how it has a potential to improve student achievement. So I believe Dr. Henry has presented at least 3 to 4 times recently, and even before that, as we had the third-party evaluation, it's been a part of that conversation. So we would, as a department, we do not see ourselves mandating that there would be a student survey. Certainly, that is the prerogative of the State Board of Education to make that decision. But we were on the journey to get to a place where if school districts wanted to use a student survey to improve achievement and growth, that we wanted to be a part of that support system, because we know that there are some school districts not having the resources to do the validation and all the things that would be necessary to use that as an instrument. So that just gives a very brief history of the journey and why we would even walk down that road.
Mr. Davis?
Like Mr. Collins, I've heard a lot of the same concerns about our approach to using student surveys, a lot of concerns from districts that it's another mandate, a lot of concerns from teachers that it'll be another punitive or a punitive measure. But I've also heard from an awful lot of teachers that, well, I just do this as a best practice. In fact, Ms. Triplett in our last meeting mentioned that. And I recognize that the surveys, there's different kinds of surveys for different purposes and so forth. But in line with the superintendent's comments, I think it'd be really effective if we started with just celebrating the teachers and districts that are effectively using students, that are giving their students voice in their own education. And let's learn from what districts are currently doing. And there'll be differences all over the place because we're a big state. And let's figure out the best practices and let's celebrate them a bit. And I think that might, one, help us be more informed, and 2, maybe build on the positive energy that's already out there and in the process raise our game. So it'll take longer, but I think we're doing good work already in this area and we ought to celebrate it and build on it.
Great.
Dr. Oxenden?
I think Dr. Fitch had her hand up first, and then I'll follow her if you don't mind.
Dr. Fitch.
Thank you. I also had a question of what is being done to learn what school systems are already doing in terms of gathering this data. And as Dr. Atkinson indicated, some school districts are going through the reaccreditation process. The whole communities have been surveyed to death.
Sure.
And it creates another layer. Ms. Triplett has talked about, again, how this is being done by individual teachers. I too am not understanding what is the rationale behind this and why we are pushing so hard for these surveys to be done. What is the proposed rollout, and is it already live to the schools now?
Yes, ma'am. So, just to back up, I don't think from the department's perspective, there is no push to roll anything out. We've made school districts aware that this survey is available to them, that they can avail themselves. Any of their teachers can log in. Everybody's students have been selected. They can sample from the teachers. We've created a process that's valid, reliable, and accessible to all districts across the state. I think where the issue is coming is the question immediately went to, is this required? And I think from the department's position, we have always said, no, this is voluntary. We are providing the opportunity for you to engage in this. We have developed this statewide model so that anybody across the state can use it. And when we do that, it is there for everyone in the state. And I think that's caused some concern. Should it be there for everyone in the state? And that's certainly a question we can discuss. But there is no rush to push this into the hands of folks to use. If anything, that's at question here is there is a desire to know what's the relationship between this measure and better student outcomes. And without participation, we can never answer that question. So if anything, if there's any push, I guess it's to get data to help us make that case that this is good for kids and students. But even then, I don't think anyone at the department is suggesting that we mandate districts to do this.
Yes, Dr. Oxenbaugh.
Thank you, Dr. Tomberlin, for coming forward with this important information about the history of student surveys in North Carolina. I have several questions. I'll begin with, I don't want to get deep in the technicalities of the survey because I'll reach a point where I don't know what I'm talking about. So I'll be very careful in saying, but one point that stands out to me, I'm looking at the range, scale of responses by students. And they're inconsistent across several, 2 or 3 or 4 items. So to me, that would play into weakening the reliability of the data because the response scales are different for the different items. In other words, it's not a strong Likert. The qualities of a Likert aren't there. Just hold that for a minute.
Sure.
You can respond to that at a later time. That might be something we want to discuss offline or, in your office or some other place. Another question has to do with the fact that these surveys are live. They are out there. Is the window still open for students to complete the survey? Is that window still open?
I think the fall window has closed.
Okay, so my concern there is, were the parents notified that in the systems that are participating in the pilot, were parents notified that their students would be participating in a survey? In other words, did the department satisfy informed consent with parents and guardians? Has that been accomplished?
I don't think so, but most districts have passive consent in regard to educational data collection. In other words, parents are advised that they actively drop out of participation rather than offering active consent. So we make it clear to the districts that no individual student data will be reported back to the district, so there's no way to connect a student with a response.
Okay, so, but let me be a bit more specific. A school system A that's participating in the pilot, has school system A, to your knowledge, maybe you're not aware of this, has that school system, the principal, the superintendent, the HR director, has anyone informed parents that your child will be taking part, maybe a letter to the parents, or has that gone out to parents and guardians?
Well, that would be the responsibility of the participating LEA. So we provide the environment. If those things are required by the district, by district policy, it would be on the LEA to say, hi, parents, we're doing a student survey, your child will participate, here's the way you opt out of that process.
I think it would be important for us to know if the participating systems have communicated any information to parents and guardians or guardians with respect to the pilot. The other question has to do with, there's still concern out there among superintendents about the developmentally appropriateness of the items. And I'm looking at one right now. This is on the 3 through 5 survey. Item number 23. When your teacher asked, "How are you?" How often do you feel that your teacher really wants to know your answer? What is that getting at?
I would say the authenticity of the relationship between the teacher and the student.
And so that has a relationship on student growth and teacher growth.
I think their comments would be much more appropriate than mine.
Ma'am?
Sure.
Okay.
By all means.
Yeah, in response to that, I'm excited about this. I do have a question before I answer that. Can teachers opt to do this survey without district-wide implementation?
Theoretically, yes.
Okay,
The icons are there,
okay.
which I think is an issue that needs to be resolved as well.
I think that would be a great place to start, because once you get teacher buy-in to this, then you're gonna have already some data there. Because this is a tool for best practice. It is just that. It is a tool to use in your classroom. I think we're getting a little more complicated than we have to be about this. When I utilize them in my classroom, I have found that those questions, like the one Dr. Oxendine was stating, are not measured anywhere else. Nowhere else do I get a true depiction of how my students see me, and if I am an authentic learner in the classroom with them, or if they see me as a sage on the stage. And that directly affects my instruction and their learning. So I did a little research of my own when I left last month and looked at my own survey that I gave and the results that I get, and I'm pretty biased when I create my own survey. I ask the questions about things that I know I'm good with doing in my classroom. The questions that are on this survey, a lot of them I wouldn't ask, because sometimes I might not want to know the answer. But in knowing that answer, it makes me a better teacher. Granted, it's not a perfect survey, but I would love to use it in my classroom. So if my district doesn't decide to implement, I would like to, please. Does that answer your question, Dr. Oxendine?
Thank you very much.
If I could,
Mr. Ford.
if I could interject. Yeah, I again, as a former classroom teacher, have trouble saying that. I have always clamored for some sort of tool that takes a more hybrid approach to assessing teacher effectiveness, because I think for a lot of teachers, there's anxiety around, especially in the accountability era of education reform, a narrow look at what really makes a good teacher. And I know we're not proposing this be part of the evaluation tool, but for the purposes of getting to that and establishing that correlation, there's a lot of nuance, because this is really social science, because we're dealing with human beings. And so there are a lot of things that quantitatively will not show up, but qualitatively, when you're in the classroom, can be withdrawn from these sort of questions. And it goes back to the issue of relationship, which I feel like is one of the most understated parts of this profession. And then when you get to those sorts of questions, and we can debate on developmental level, but getting to your issue of how appropriate is it, it's incredibly appropriate for creating the atmosphere of learning, for being culturally responsive, all of the things that are embedded in good teaching that don't often show up in the metrics that we look at. And so I would be personally excited. I used to give a survey of my own, probably not nearly as sophisticated as this. And it's hard to look at, but for those who are honest and critical, it really does make you better as a teacher in ways that your standard evaluation or, an analysis of test scores just can't do.
Thank you very much. I'm going to wrap this up. I feel like I've taken too much of your time. One of the things that I would like to see happen, and I would hope that my colleagues would at least entertain this, is that we do a little bit better groundwork and maybe start anew with this whole concept of student surveys in order to build ownership into this concept among our teachers, especially among our superintendents, who continue to raise questions about the items. They're probably not that confident that this isn't headed towards some mandate, even though last month, I think, we made it clear that no, this is not a mandated, this isn't a requirement, it isn't in mandate, but still superintendents need to be assured of that, because, and going back to the word, the structure of the items, I don't know, I was reading something recently about the MET and the Massachusetts effective
Measures of effective teaching.
measures of effectiveness, right. And it does draw an intersection between student survey or outcomes and where teachers are in terms of needing directed support or monitored support. So I'm wondering if that's not where there's some thinking that we head in that direction. Before whatever we do, whatever the next steps might be, it's just important that we pause for a while. I'm not saying how long. We bring superintendents together and teachers and others together, and we start at some basic level. I would like to see us work on these items and get the wording right, to get the concepts more appropriate for a third grader. The 3 through 5 scale, to me, just needs lots of work.
So, my response to that would be, the only way to effectively develop these questions is to use the data generated by the student responses to determine whether the items are functioning the way that we think they are. This question has been consistently raised with superintendents and with others, that these items are just not right. And the data do not support that position. So I would be concerned about developing a student survey that feels right to adults, but does not resonate with children. And if the data are telling us that these items resonate with children who are taking the survey, frankly, I'm much more interested in finding out what the students think than what the adults think in this particular measure. And I'm afraid that that's what we're proposing here, is that we let adults craft these items irrespective of what the data tell us that how the students are interpreting them. And I found no evidence in the data that these items are problematic, and we look for it constantly. And so that discussion, I'm happy to enter into it, but we have to use the data to drive that discussion and not perception, I guess is what I'm concerned about.
I would have a question about that from the standpoint that we're going to have a high percentage of students in our low-performing school systems, let's be real, who can't read very well and comprehend very well. So to assume that that a third grader who is reading far below grade level is not proficient, to assume that the student will be able to read an item or read the 29 items, I'm not sure, maybe 29 items, in 3 minutes. I think you said 3 minutes and a little bit over 3 minutes. I just question the reliability of those findings. So, and that's a
Sure.
rhetorical comment.
Absolutely, and I think we have sent those findings to the board. So
Okay,
Thank you.
Dr. Atkinson, and I think she's last. I don't see any other, and then we're going to take a 10-minute break.
Perhaps we need to go back to what Mr. Davis suggested to celebrate some of the school districts using the data. So if the board wishes, perhaps another step as we continue down this road is to bring some of the school districts to the board to have them discuss how they've used the data, how it's worked for them, what they see as pitfalls, what do they see as that which has helped them. And I know that with advanced ed, there are student surveys and parent surveys, community surveys. We could have them also to talk about that. And we could bring some of the superintendents who have, through the years, been actively involved in using student surveys as a starting point. Of course, that's a little difficult to have a long history because 85 more of our superintendents have not been in those positions when we started this process a long time ago. So I think that that may be a good place to continue the conversation.
Madam Superintendent, I think that's a good idea. I just would say to you that it's no secret to you, there's a flashpoint here, and some of that flashpoint has to do with whether it's going to be mandatory and whether it's not going to be mandatory, and if it's voluntary, who can volunteer? Can it be a teacher, just the teacher, or is it the LEA, is it the school? And then, you know, some of the questions I get are associated with, is it public information? If a teacher opts in?
That's the key. That's the thing that was my concern.
And so all of those things factor into, I think, a dialogue that puts a time out here, because I think, you know, I heard you say to the superintendents, or at least those 15 in that room, that this would be voluntary. And yet some communication within the next few days made that, caused them to think that it might be mandatory. And so I think we got to recapture it.
Right.
And I think that's what Dr. Oxendine was saying, to recapture.
Okay, folks, thank you, Dr. Tomberlin, and we'll reconvene at 25 past the hour.